Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it is time for the Friday Night Football Games tier list video for the 2025 UFL season. Yes, I know a lot of people have been looking forward to this one. This one was suggested during one of the initial Friday Night Football Games. I believe Format said it, but if somebody else said it, put down below. But this was a really good idea, as Friday Night Football was a very big deal for the UFL. Having a single game on every week at the exact same time, same network, was something that people have been asking for literal years. I know I've been clamoring for this ever since the USFL in 2022, as the biggest issue of spring football has been the insane just variety of when games are played. Having a game at the same time was great. And while TV ratings may not have been exactly what people expected, some people say they were better than expected, some say worse. The point is, we got a really wide array of games. We went from a bunch of pretty poor games early on in the season to a couple of just insane bangers to some just solid games. So let's get right into it with the first game, the Battlehawks Roughnecks. Yeah, this one was one of the football games of all time. Now, it wasn't boring, but it was a high-scoring game where the Battlehawks just killed the Roughnecks. Look, this game wasn't even close. I mean, the Battlehawks just absolutely crushed the Roughnecks in a game that was kind of sad to watch. The final score was like 31-6. St. Louis just kind of dominated them. They had like over 300 more yards almost of total offense than the Roughnecks. And the Roughnecks didn't even score to like the fourth quarter. This game was just not a great one, obviously. It was a total blowout. There's really not much to say that can be said about this one. I know we talked about it during the stream. The fact is, this wasn't an F-tier game. As an F-tier game, as I mentioned before, is a truly just bad watch. This one, though, wasn't even mediocre. There's pretty much nothing really memorable about this game. You had like the one massively long rushing touchdown, but overall, this was a D-tier game. It wasn't that good. It's pretty hard to argue that it should be anywhere aside from D. Again, it wasn't the worst game ever. It wasn't like this was, again, the Maulers Bandits 2022 game, which was like 17-3 or something like that, where it's a low-scoring blowout. This was a blowout that had a lot of scoring, so there's at least some fun to be had with it on a rewatch. But if you're going to rewatch a Friday Night Football game, this is not one of the ones you really want to rewatch. Definitely a D-tier game. The second Friday Night Football game of the season was the Stallions versus the Panthers. Now, this matchup, of course, was a big deal at that moment because the Stallions had just come off a Week 1 loss to the DC Defenders. And Michigan, again, to this point, which they still had not ever beaten the Stallions. So this was, of course, a big deal for them. Bryce Perkins had this really great Week 1, and Week 2 was wondering exactly how he was going to play. This game was definitely better than Week 1, but not by a ton. Look, the final score was a pretty damn close one, 21-12, but Michigan, all 12 of their points came in the fourth quarter. It looked like they were having this great comeback, and a main reason for that was because they just made a lot of special teams mistakes in this game. You had a bunch of really just great returns for Birmingham. You had a couple really bad ones for Michigan. Of course, one of the bigger moments of the game was later in the game when Bryce Perkins decided to try and throw a Hail Mary instead of running for a first down. Then throwing like on a 3rd and 8, like a 4-yard pass just to punt it on 4th down was really rough. Yes, I know Birmingham technically could have won this game more. They went like 1 of 4 in the red zone. But overall, they proved how good Harrison Mevis would end up being this season. Overall, this is one that was kind of a tougher watch because there's a lot of just big mistakes made. We all talk about special teams as, what usually ends up being the deciding factor in close games. But not in this way where it's just one team made mistake after mistake on special teams and one team just, didn't. This is also the weakest Bryce Perkins game of the entire season. So if you're watching this, Bryce Perkins season, how well he played, this is the one you kind of want to forget. I think this is definitely a C-tier game. It was still definitely better than the Roughnecks Battlehawks game because at least there was some, suspense of it being a close game. Michigan's defense playing a really solid game. Of course, the whole storyline of Alex Magoo getting hurt almost immediately and having Matt Corral come off the bench to try and win this game for the Stallions. It was a pretty good thing there. This was still obviously during the time of Danny Etling getting a lot of playing time as well. So it was a rougher one in that sense, but overall I think C tier is fair for this one. Better than the Battlehawks, Roughnecks, yes, but is it still a good game? No. Now the third game of the season was the Renegades versus the Stallions and the 10-9, and man, what a game. If you've been watching the channel pretty much during this whole season, you probably already know exactly where this game is going. Yes, this game's final score is really close, but as an actual football game, this was a pain to watch. When you want to talk about just bad football, this is the game you should put on. The Stallions, all 10 of their points were in the second half, and all the Renegades' points were in the first half. The Renegades went 0 of 4 in the red zone, just an abysmal stat line. The ref ball was insane. For those of you who don't remember or didn't watch this game, at the end of the game, well, there's two main instances. There was one instance where Sal Cannella fumbled the football, and it looked pretty clear that it was touched by a Stallions player who was out of bounds, meaning it should have been ruled out of bounds Arlington ball. It wasn't given to Stallions. Then, of course, there was the false start, where on a fourth down, the Stallions were doing a fourth down, and through an interception should have been game over. But Mike Pereira went on the whole replay review thing and saw there was a false start, which meant that the Renegades got essentially screwed because it was considered a dead ball foul. Now, the reason that was so bad is because, to the shock of not many, because of all the backlash the league received from that, they would almost never go back to this 2-minute thing again. Because remember, under 5 minutes, the UFL Command Center is supposed to be able to review pretty much anything that's considered obvious. And there would be other instances of plays that could have easily been reviewed, whether they be pass interference or pass interference no calls, other false starts, that ended up not getting reviewed. And it's a pretty good argument you made that was because of this instance. This was a very big black eye for the league. The fact that the Renegades weren't able to decline it was insane. Because the big difference is that this wasn't a dead ball foul in a normal sense. This was called after the play was fully done. All the players played it like it was a normal play, and then to go back and decline it or not be able to decline it felt really messed up in a lot of ways. And it just kind of felt like the Renegades got screwed. Now, yes, the Renegades still could have stopped them on the subsequent fourth down try, which they didn't. This time did get the final touchdown. But again, the Renegades, to the point of them still not deserving the win, went 0-4 in the red zone. It was just an abysmal game for all intents and purposes. The Stallions got one of, if not the single most undeserved win in the history of this era of spring football. And the Renegades also choked one of the easiest wins of all time by, again, never scoring a touchdown despite being in the red zone on 4 separate occasions. The ref ball was terrible. It was a rough watch. I made an entire video of this one. This is an easy F-tier game. Easily one of the worst spring football games of these 5 seasons dating back to the 2022 USFL. This is one of those games where you are going to remember it, but you're remembering it for all the wrong reasons. It's like the Fail Mary in the NFL, right? Where that single play essentially ended the ref strike because the NFL realized just how bad the replacement refs were. In a lot of ways, this is what kind of changed a lot of rules that would end up coming forward with the 5-minute overturn by, the replay booth. It was a rough game. It was a black eye on the season for sure. Easy F tier. Now, the 4th game of the season for Friday Night Football ended up being the Panthers Showboats in Michigan. Again, we have another game that wasn't great. Now, spoilers, this is the last game of this stretch of just poor Friday Night Football games. We got 4 pretty weak Friday Night Football games before we got to a couple really good bangers. As for this one, what's the deal with it? It was a total blowout. This is one of those games where the Showboats, again, just like last year, couldn't stick with a quarterback. They played both T. Will and E.J. Perry. Perkins did play the whole game due to injuries to Danny Etling, and he had a really great game. This is one of those games, one of his better ones of the season. Yes, it was kind of close in the first half, but overall Michigan just kind of went and dominated this game. We did see To'o really start to become his own in this game as well, that rushing touchdown earlier in the game. And it was just a really good game for Michigan, right? Nate McCurry had a great game. Red zone was efficient. What it really came down to was Memphis went like 1 of 10 in this game on 3rd down, just pitiful 0 of 2 on like 4th down. And they only put up like less than 170 yards on offense compared to Michigan, who put up, close to 400. It was just a really bad game in that sense, where it was just another one of those blowouts. Very, very similar to the Houston-St. Louis game, which is why I'm also putting this one in D tier. This was probably the single most forgettable Friday Night Football game of the season, if I'm going to be honest. Mainly because the Showboats would then immediately be in a much more memorable game literally the week after this one. As well as the fact that this was just not a great one in terms of it being another blowout where Memphis just couldn't get things going on offense. This was after the whole beginning of the season where Jay Adams was just dominating every single week. So it wasn't even like the Showboats had a ton going for him. It was just a rough game. The 5th game of the Friday Night Football season was the Showboats Stallions. And man, this was a great one. I know to this point it's been pretty negative, but this is where things start to change. This game was awesome. This is one of those games that heading into it, we were like just, joking about how good it would end up being. Of course, this is when the Stallions were still dealing with quarterback injuries, so they were starting Case Cookus. It was the revenge game for him. And on the other front, after that pathetic offensive performance in Week 4, the Showboats decided to change from E.J. Perry and T. Will to Dresser Win, the Dwinners. And so we had Dresser Win versus Case Cookus, a QB matchup that heading into the season, because remember, heading into the season, like a couple weeks prior, neither guy was even on their rosters. So it was a massive deal there. And man, this game would be insane. It would be the first UFL game to go to overtime. You heard that right. First one in OT, and obviously the first in any of the leagues since the USFL's North Championship game between the Maulers and Panthers. It was crazy. The Showboats had this initial lead. It was a pretty big lead initially. It was like 17-3. Then Birmingham was making this comeback. Then in the fourth quarter, Birmingham just had like 2 scoring drives at the very end of the game, and it made you think, oh my goodness, they're actually going to choke this. The Showboats are going to lose this game. And then it was forced to OT. And the Showboats, perfect. They stopped Birmingham every time, and they scored every time. Now, there was some, ref ball stuff some would say with Skipples trying to challenge, calling the wrong number. And, of course, this is still with all the super challenge rules being kind of weird, which we'll talk about in another video. But it made for some really compelling TV. And a lot of people who hated how the Stallions beat the Arlington Renegades viewed it as karma for how they beat the Renegades. So it had that going for it. Again, the Dwinners versus Case Cookus was insane. The fact is, this is a game that no one thought would be this good. The Showboats actually beating Birmingham in overtime in this way was insane. This was also just an incredible week of football, and this game I still stand by was the best overall that week. A 24-20 overtime game where the Showboats ended up outgaining Birmingham in total yardage, despite still not even playing well on third down and not even going, decent in the red zone. Both their touchdowns were deeper touchdowns as they ended up going like 0-2 in the red zone. This was an incredible game, S tier. One of the best games of the season. I know we did have a lot of really good games. We probably had the most amount of S tier games this season than maybe any other UFL or USFL XFL season, as there was a couple other later ones that were incredible. This definitely deserves it. This game went from being like a solid C tier for the very first quarter. It's still early to look at like a B tier, then an A tier, and then that end of the fourth quarter and overtime period. I mean, it was like a guarantee Memphis was going to choke. We all knew they were losing. When they let Marlon Williams get that touchdown at the end of the game, we're like, man, it's over. They lost. Then to go perfect in overtime, nobody saw that coming. It was an incredible win for the Showboats. Definitely deserves the S tier marking for this game. The 6th Friday Night Football game of the season was the Renegades versus the Battlehawks. Now, this was a very important game. Just a couple weeks prior, the Battlehawks had lost to the Renegades due to a lot of really weird things happening. And, of course, it ended up being the second start and, third game of Max Duggan playing for the Battlehawks. At this point in the season, it looked like the Renegades were basically controlling their own destiny to make the playoffs as long as they won this game. St. Louis Battlehawks needed to get the W. They ended up getting the W 12-6. Overall for this game, it's a weird one to rank because it was a very low-scoring game, but it was one of those where every drive legitimately felt like it mattered. Kicks were a big deal as you had certain instances where teams were not taking points. The Renegades earlier on in the game decided to go for and not take the points, which ended up kind of backfiring on them at the very end of the game, which is the thing that you do love to see is when a team doesn't take points, they end up losing. Look, a lot of people hate when teams kick field goals in, let's say, 4th and goal from the 3-yard line. But sometimes you got to just get the points because they'll end up costing you in the end. St. Louis, they won the game. Now, it was a sloppy game in a quarterback standpoint. It was one of the weaker games from Perez, and Max Duggan had a sub-35 completion percentage. He went 7 of 19 for some terrible stat line. Sailors didn't have an incredible game. This was mainly a kicker's duel. I know there was a touchdown, but this mainly was a kicking battle. Because outside of the Max Duggan touchdown to Hakeem Butler, it was a rough day passing for both teams, really. Overall, though, I think this is probably a C-tier game. This wasn't a bad game. Yes, it was a low-scoring one, but again, it was one of those low-scoring games where it felt like everything mattered. So it did have that going for it, but it still didn't have nearly enough offense or enough big defensive plays to really put it higher. It just kind of felt like a rough game from both offenses. This was, Max Duggan not playing incredibly well. They went terrible third down percentage. Both these teams combined for 8 of 26 on third down, which is just an obscenely terrible number. So it's pretty hard to give them any credit even on that front. So I think that overall this was a C-tier game. I would rather rewatch this one than the other Battlehawks Friday Night Football game against the Roughnecks. But I think this is definitely on that same tier as the Stallions-Panthers. Could have been a lot better. This was a big marquee matchup that just didn't live up to the hype. So I think C-tier is solid for this one. Now the 4th to last Friday Night Football game of the season was between the DC Defenders and the San Antonio Brahmas. Now, this was a really good game. Again, this second half of Friday Night Football was much better than the first half, and this was another one of those really just good banger games. Really had no right to be. I mean, heading into this game, we did not think too much of it. It was Kevin Hogan against Jordan Ta'amu, and this is before Ta'amu's MVP claim really became somewhat justified, even, and then, of course, it was Kevin Hogan still being like, wow, really, Kevin Hogan? This is a great game. The final score was 32-24, so this was a legit high-scoring game. And the stat-wise, you wouldn't think so. I mean, DC went like some terrible third down percentage, but they were perfect in fourth down, which gave them a couple extra drives. San Antonio actually dominated time possession by almost like 10 minutes, and it didn't even matter. Both these teams had very similar stats in a lot of ways, just dominated in total yards, like 350 each. This was a great game by Kevin Hogan. Now, he had a couple bad fumbles. Well, he had one really bad fumble. But aside from that, passing-wise, this was a great game by Kevin Hogan. This was the game that Te'amu really cemented himself as an MVP candidate because he had a consistent game where he ended up throwing for a ton of yards, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, like a 70 completion percentage. Just a great game. It's what really set him in the MVP conversation legitimately, and not just because of him having the yardage numbers. It was a great game. Overall, though, DC did pull it off. They did end up getting the comeback in that fourth quarter. They put up 13 points in it, and they ended up winning. It was a really solid game. And so the question of where this ranks, though, I know some might be shocked at this, but I'm putting this at A tier. I think this was a really, really good game, but I think that it wasn't as good as the Stallions versus the Showboats. I think there's another game that was a bit better than this one on Friday Night Football. I would understand if you put it in S because it was a high-scoring game, but just it's something about DC football this year where it was kind of hard to really love their games because their style of football being this effort go deep mentality that during the season made a lot of their games kind of feel the same. The main point was the fact that Kevin Hogan had this great performance, and it was the second time where the San Antonio Brahmas just happened to play really well against the defenders, which was really hilarious. They lost. You had the incredible Steven Solanos pass in this game as well, or you had, I believe, in this one. It was a great game. It's pretty hard to not really put this one up there. I think this one deserves it. Or no, the Steven Solanos was for another game, my bad. But still, this was a really solid game. I think this definitely deserves to be A tier. Great game. Now, the third to last Friday Night Football game of the 2025 UFL season was between the Showboats and the Brahmas. This is the final Tank Bowl of the season. It was a good one. The final score was 24-22 overtime, the second ever UFL overtime game, and the Showboats won it again. This game probably was the single most fun game to watch of the entire season. Now, is it because it was beautiful, great football? No, if you wanted something like that, the Battlehawk Stallions was more your cup of tea. But this game was fun. When you watch football, if you were to tell somebody to watch a football game, this is one of those games you would want to see. For the wrong reasons, absolutely. Troy Williams ended up being the winning quarterback despite having like 5 of 11 for like 30 yards. Kevin Hogan threw 3 interceptions, with one of them being the worst you'll ever see. He was literally scrambling up the middle, saw a dude right in front of him and just threw it to him. It was bad, but it was fun. You had a tight end make the best pass of the day from either quarterback. The best quarterback of the day was Steven Solanos, who had this beautiful touch on D. Anderson, who was like a former Showboat that year. Incredible. San Antonio dominated. They had like over 100 more yards. They had literally over 10 more minutes time possession. They had like twice as good a third down percentage, and they still ended up losing. Hilarious. I mean, absolutely hilarious. Both teams were bad in the red zone, 1-3. It was an incredible game. It was so much fun to watch. In terms of streams, it's one of the most fun streams he had all season because of it. San Antonio pulling off that tying back-to-back field goals where they ended up like missing a field goal. Then they had to try it again. They got a second attempt. They kicked it, and it was good to force OT. And you're like, surely the Showboats can't do it again where they blow the lead just to win in overtime, and that's exactly what happened. Overtime was great. This was an S-tier game. Look, it may not have been great football, but it was fun football. When you're talking about a game, sometimes it's a matter of how enjoyable it is. This one was enjoyable. It was two teams making so many mistakes, yet they still were able to score because you had a defense that couldn't get turnovers in the Showboats, who ended up over doubling their turnover differential or their turnovers or takeaways this game against a defense that was just pitiful. But then Troy Williams did nothing, as this is the start of Jim Turner trying to play each quarterback for one game, which only lasted this game, and it was just always great. This was a great game. This is an S-tier game. I won't have any slander for this one. This was a football game that you love to watch because it wasn't perfect football, because it was just fun football. Mistakes, incredible. It was easy S-tier. Now, the second to last Friday Night Football game was the Battlehawks versus the Brahmas. Now, this game was a Brahmas home game that was in St. Louis because this is the game they ended up losing. Let's call it like it is. This one was the other arguable most forgettable football game of the Friday Night Football season. It was a 39-13 blowout. The Brahmas went back to Kellen Mond. I know, shocking after his performance in Week 8. But they went back to Kellen Mond, and he was not great. They played both Duggan and Silvers. Silvers actually looked really solid. Hell, Duggan looked pretty solid as well. Again, St. Louis almost had twice as many yards as San Antonio did. St. Louis dominated them overall. San Antonio was like 0-3 in third down. They were at that point where they were just kind of trying everything, just throwing, everything at the wall, hoping something sticks, and nothing really did. I mean, by the time the Brahmas scored, it was already like 15-6, so the game was essentially over already. It was a rough watch. Deshaun Corbin had a really solid game, but that was pretty much the only really good thing you can say about the Brahmas. The fact is the Battlehawks played backups for a lot of the game, especially in offense, and still ended up dominating. But again, like with the first Battlehawks game of the Friday Night Football season, it was still a fun game in the regards to how many points were scored, but it wasn't a good game. It's another D-tier one. It's just like the other Battlehawks game we talked about in week 1, where it was one team just kind of toying with their opponent, and it was just not even close. St. Louis, yeah, I think this is definitely a fair spot for it. It just wasn't a great game, which sucks that St. Louis, all their Friday Night Football games really didn't have that many great ones. Well, we'll talk about the last one, but definitely a shame that this could have been a lot better. Heading into the season, you expected this to be a big matchup, but of course the Brahmas, a lot of things happen. A.J. Smith, Wade Phillips, the GM, the quarterbacks, a lot of things happened this season. The Brahmas sucked, but D tier, I think it's solid for this one. The final Friday Night Football game of the 2025 season was between the DC Defenders and the St. Louis Battlehawks. This game was in DC and wild. The rain just poured. You got like a couple of drives off, and then the rain just started pouring. Lightning was happening. The game had to be delayed for 47 minutes. When they came back onto the field, it was insanely wet and still raining. Then the second half wasn't as wet, but still was. This was a battle of backups. Important note, it was Brandon Sotos versus Mike DeLillo. We did not see any Max Duggan. We didn't see even any Jacob Sailors. Did not see any Jordan Ta'amu. You ended up getting a game that statistically was pretty close in the yardage standpoint, as both teams ended up having around 240-ish yards. But one team was actually decent on third down percentage. One team was awful. St. Louis was like 1-7. DC was like 5 of 12, 13-ish. But St. Louis still ended up getting the W. Why? Well, St. Louis did score in that first drive, which was, of course, before the whole weather issue. DC did end up getting a safety in this game, which was hilarious. But that was pretty much it. DC didn't score any other points in the fourth quarter, but the thing with this game, it was a bad weather game. So automatically, it's going to be a much different experience watching. We didn't really get many of those this season. In fact, this was really the only true bad weather game. Because, even the Memphis-Arlington one, because of how far back it was delayed, it was nowhere near like this. This was a bad weather game, which in spring football, you really don't get those that often because of the fact that, again, you're, kind of missing out on a lot of that, time for snow. While it's still possible, you're just not going to see it that often. And even rainy-wise, this was even more rain than, let's say, the DC-Birmingham game last year. So this was a really fun game in that aspect. But it's pretty tough to put this one really that high. I think B tier is a solid place for this one. It was a more enjoyable game than the C tier games because of the weather. But it just, let's call it like it is. You're not watching this one over the 2 overtime games or the DC San Antonio game. You're just not. So I think B tier is a solid place for it. It was a very interesting game, seeing all the weather and all the things that happened with it. Definitely made for a very interesting watch. Fun game overall, but yeah, when you have bad weather like this, you have a lot of throws that should have been caught that weren't because they just kind of tipped off. Everybody's, not wearing gloves because of how wet the ball is, which is a very different visual. So B tier solid. Overall, that'll do it. This has been Zom Fox. Let me know down below what your tier list is for this season's Friday Night Football games. I think that a couple of them are pretty clear. I think that the Arlington-Birmingham game was just clearly a week 1. The 2 overtime games are really fun. Again, I know some people have the San Antonio DC game higher, but I just don't. Overall, the first half of Friday Night Football, basically until that Memphis-Birmingham game, was really rough. Then we started getting a lot of really solid games. Hopefully next year we have better Friday Night Football games overall, as again, it definitely felt like a weaker group compared to most opening week games. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be notified when I load any videos. Again, I don't know exactly when this video is being posted. It might be literally a week and a half before this video gets posted when I'm recording it because of just kind of waiting to see what news comes out, whether it be awards, whether it be expansion stuff coming out, don't know. But I will do at least 2 videos a week during the UFL off season. I don't know how many games are going to stream in the NFL season when that starts up in a few months. I know I did one every couple of weeks last year. We'll see what I do this year or this season, but I don't know. Think about becoming a community member as well as 99 cents a month. You get an exclusive video every month. You get multiple team emojis you get to use during comments and live stream chats and other benefits. And as always, guys, have a great night.